Hi everybody, this is Leo Vallot. I've just written a new blog entitled Machine Intelligence Internationalism, and now I'm ready to start shooting it into video. This is one of my futuristic videos, sort of an addendum to my short series Revolution from the Top, in which I had given an outline of humanity's transition into the machine intelligence and robotics age. Just as my The Power of Mythology Part 2 was similarly looking into the future. So yeah, let's get started. The life principle is the propensity inherent in matter to evolve an active will and consciousness for seeking out nutrients in order to grow or sustain itself in its individual units, and then often expanding its coherency further at the collective level by organizing its individual units into larger organisms or organizations. So it is that we see that the principle of life organization at first creates individual animals, and then organizing at the second order, we see the creation of societies of animals, where the peaceful animals combine into collectives, such as hives, packs, or herds, and peaceful human beings collect into groups ranging from families up to organizations that can comprise entire civilizations. If we were to allow this life principle of organization to progress to its ultimate end, then we would become a one-world civilization with a one-world international government. But as we are, humanity's organizational development has been arrested at the level of toxic nationalism and the effectiveness of human governance retarded by the anarchy of democracy and the policy of treating individual rights as being more sacred than the life of the greater collective. Yes, many times in human history, we have attained to the level of empire, that is, the unitary organization of a number of nations into the next larger unit of political jurisdiction above the national, and a prelude state for internationalism. The greatest benefit that empire can bring to its constituent nations is peace. But then follows the prosperity that accompanies the far larger extent of trade made possible by opening up and securing the roads and trade routes between the nations. Then, all the great achievements in art, learning, technologies, and moral development, which I may be underrating as secondary benefits, have come from out of these imperial periods, where the active and educated elites from each included society had the opportunity for comparing notes and subsequently following the best practices. But not every root and shoot that springs forth from evolution survives the trials imposed by material conditionality. In the case of empire, we see that historically the limits for expansion were set by the time lag and expense involved in having to administer peripheral nations from some central hub over very great distances. Yes, in my horse dreams video, I discussed that the domestication of the horse allowed for innovations in communication and transportation that made it possible to have empires to the extent that we had seen in history. But then new limits were reached, and the larger empires had trouble maintaining coherent control from center to edge, and so local governors were appointed to administer the subordinate nations. But this kind of compromise retained the jurisdictional boundaries of each member state, giving hope to the nationalistic recidivists who'd wish to bring back their own warlords and ruling classes. So, Anytime an empire would receive some great crippling shock, usually some invasion of barbarians, the empire would again break down into a cluster of independent warring states, such as we see now happening after the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the Balkans with the collapse of first the Ottoman Empire, and then, after a limited recovery, with the demise of Imperial Yugoslavia. But just as the horse made the ancient empires at least provisionally possible during favorable periods, well, now we have the new innovation of direct and nearly instantaneous communication, and one can fly to any city in the world within 15 hours. So with the problems of hub-to-peripheral communication and transportation being largely resolved, well, we can see that a world empire could become viable if there weren't other reasons for worry. So what could these reasons be? Well, peoples are divided by language, religion, culture, social moral orientation, race or visible ethnicity, politics, and economic competition. So now let's look to see if there's anything we can do about all that. Well, the separation by language, religion, culture, and social moral orientation can largely be dealt with in the schools, but it would require the support of a centralized authoritarian government that could both insist upon universal school attendance as well as silencing any dissenting media that could endeavor to contradict the curriculums. Also, the trend I see in the world today is with the national governments shifting the cost of education to local governments who usually use property taxes to fund education, which translates into the poorer neighborhoods having underfunded schools. Or expenses for education are shifted to the public directly by defunding the public schools to such an extent that they fall to such unacceptable levels of quality that parents feel compelled to send their children to private schools at entirely their own expense. So yeah, the end result is a lack of uniformity in education. But for civilization to establish a common culture, common language, common religion, along with a common social morality, well, we would require a common, centrally funded and stipulated education. Yep, the current fixation in regards to local control is simply the very definition of anarchy. A kind of permission that central government surrenders to each group or jurisdiction to hate everybody else and to actively plot against them. Yes, I've often pointed out that most people aren't even intelligent enough to manage their own lives, that education can only cultivate existing intelligence but can't grow it. And educating students of even above average human intelligence can only accomplish so much. As with training monkeys, there's a limit to the tricks they can be taught. But then, remember, we need to contextualize the education that would be required for the future machine intelligence age. You see, nowadays, education is geared toward creating a society of willing and capable wage slaves, a system that is now breaking down because our modern high-tech economy requires far more intelligent human beings than actually exist, so that the economy is now being significantly held back by inefficiencies related to human error and incompetence. It's the Peter principle metastasizing into every nook and cranny of our economy, with employees everywhere being forced to work above their levels of competence and therefore screwing up nearly everything they touch. This failure of humanity to be able to keep up with technology will be a major driver in bringing about the machine intelligence and robotics age, just to keep up with all the work that should be getting done right. But then, well, why would human beings need to be educated at all if it couldn't be gainfully exploited by some ruling class? The answer there is that being civilized is an ideal that comes with a large list of do's and don'ts, and people need to be taught how to be acceptably human, or society will collapse into anarchy and chaos. So yes, the education of the future will focus on making us as socially, emotionally, artistically, and intellectually capable as it is possible for us to become, where our current system conditions us to wage slavery. Also, in the machine intelligence age, we might expect education to continue for a lifetime. You see, with machine intelligence and robotics eliminating the professional sphere for human activities, the system will then focus on enriching the private and social lives of the adult population. That is, to fulfill people's needs for adventure, excitement, beauty, wonder, or anything else that is wholesome and which motivates us. The system would sponsor and provide the intelligent resources for managing positive and popular activities conceived of or initiated by individuals or groups, as well as coordinating such groups with similar groups, providing for exchange traveling and annual conventions or whatever. Then, in acting upon this goal of fostering cultural enrichment, the system could make the most intriguing use of its total surveillance apparatus by gauging the personality requirements for each individual and then steering him or her toward what he or she would most prefer to do, and birds of a feather would be encouraged to flock together. Where in our present society, we're left to our own resources, and unless fate intervenes, it is probably true that we can live out our entire lives without meeting those who would have become our best friends if only we had become introduced. Division by race or visibly detectable ethnicity in the machine intelligence age, well, I believe that it's not such a great cause of worry in itself, because the evidence we see tells us that such division is largely politically motivated and propagated through the media. That is, it's a kind of artificially induced racism. Really, endemic racism would be like any pathological cultural element that could be tackled in the schools through education. But if only the schools didn't actively instill racism, then we have reasons to believe that a decidedly non-racist media could go a long ways toward blunting the worst aspects of overt racism. Yes, I think we have what amounts to proof that a conscientiously controlled media can have a very benevolent effect countering racism. For, you see, we know that racist impulses significantly declined in the United States from the 1950s up until the 1980s, when the news and opinion media was then comprised of only 3 television networks, all corporately centered in New York City, and all the major newspapers were covering their news using only 2 wire services, also based in New York, while movies and television entertainment were coming from out of the liberal Los Angeles area. So, with all major media the centralized and decidedly non-racist communities, the centuries-old wounds of racial division had begun to heal. But the advent of 1,000-channel cable in the 1980s, and then the unregulated social media from the mid-90s on, giving full expression to the natural ugliness of free speech among the marginally educated, and the rogue billionaires who would wish to manipulate those same marginally educated, well, the United States now seems perched on the verge of a genocidal racial civil war. Yes, I can understand that American people of color would find this very alarming, and so certainly their natural reaction would be to protest such degeneracy in political policies and attitudes. But calculations based on real-world social and political dynamics should warn these minorities that any response, besides maybe attempting total silence and invisibility, would unfortunately occasion an amplified counter-reaction among the majority whites. Yes, however noble and blameless their cause, if minorities take to the streets with looting, vandalism, and arson becoming their backdrop, well, the white racist media outlets would be quick to alert on such uprisings as being anti-white racial provocations in and of themselves. Examples are numerous, but just to review one instance, well, there was the tragic murder of George Floyd, a black man, by police in broad daylight, which, because it was caught on video, became the focus of national attention. And so at first there was a huge shift in public sentiment toward implementing large-scale policy reforms in policing, all before any activism entered in. But then came Black Lives Matter, and activists immediately began what they define against all realistic expectation as peaceful protests, some of which actually turned into ugly scenes of riot and arson, which became the media face for Black Lives Matter. And then the initial general goodwill of the public for police reform evaporated as the racist reaction to black activism took its place. So yes, it goes against the spirit of activism, but clear thinking tells us that loud and morally compelling complaints and protests from the minority communities might only just serve to bring the majority avalanche down upon their heads. A minority that expresses only a passive sadness under all its tribulations and injustices might inspire sympathy, but expressions of even righteous anger often only arouse fear and then reaction. And then, even allies to the minority cause may react to the off-putting effects of minority anger, feeling caught up in its apparently reverse discriminatory blast, by distancing or withdrawing from coalitions where they clearly no longer feel welcomed as equals. And we need to keep in mind that black pride can be as effectively dangerous for blacks as white pride, by isolating them against a majority that can wield far more resources. Yes, we should remember that pride, while being somehow a modern virtue, was in traditional times considered to be the chief vice of the devil himself. And it was for their pride that the fallen angels fell. Yes, by all that's sacred in world traditions, it is humility that should be our virtue. And the reason for this is clear, that humility makes friends while pride makes enemies. Also, I can only guess that if we had full surveillance now, we would find that by far the greatest number of privately owned military-style combat arms are owned by overt white racists, and that there are no contingency plans at either the state or federal levels in regards to how to respond to and stop any genocidal uprising by these same white nationalists and militias. But one glimmer of good news here is that the federal law enforcement agencies find no groups easier to infiltrate than white supremacist organizations. You see, federal agents, mostly white, would only need to fake a southern drawl to blend right in. And racists know this, which makes them afraid to openly recruit, plan, and organize among themselves. They don't know whom to trust. But that still leaves me to fear some hugely reverberating spontaneous event that could touch off a wave of genocidal violence. And the only warning our red state urban communities of color might get are that convoys of heavily armed pickup trucks are already on the highways and coming their way. But now I wonder if any community groups in these vulnerable red state urban centers are making contingency plans of their own. Here I think that the minority communities should realize that they include among themselves hundreds of thousands of Army veterans to whom the practical considerations of fighting a battle might occur more readily than to the usual community activists whose skill sets are more aligned with provoking fights than with surviving them. So yes, social division by all kinds of political strife can obviously be a huge problem in the free nations, the anarchist democracies. There the root problem is unregulated speech, where private individuals, in proportion to the extent of their private wealth, can popularly advocate for the supremacy of their own private groups and special interests, while spreading incitements for a factionalism intended to divide and destabilize the remainders of the society. Yes, social media has taught anybody who is still intellectually lucid that freedom of speech is now weaponized and therefore too dangerous to leave in the hands of unsupervised and marginally educated public, as well as with the rogue billionaires who contrive to profit by giving such powerful inciters of chaos and anarchy a forum. It being now a scientific certainty that anger, hate, and violence are far more popular to the viewing public than are peace, love, and goodwill. Yes, the internet was supposed to save us, but so far we only see that on the largest scale possible it has only been reverting us back to the jungle. But we've been looking at politics and government as being the source fountains of ultimate power in the world. But the truth is that effective power resides in wealth. Yes, we only have to review the works of the great historian, Arnold Toynbee, who reviewed the collapses of the last 20 civilizations and correlated them all to the circumstance of there occurring a concentration of wealth at the top into the hands of the few, who by the power of their wealth achieve an ascendancy over the public powers of government and then, with predictably human short-sightedness, evade taxation, thus strangulating off the public expenditures necessary for the maintenance of the social, military, and economic infrastructures that would be necessary for even their own elite classes' eventual survival. Yeah, in my short video series, Revolution from the Top, I explain how the super wealthy might be able to make it work for themselves this time around. Yeah, it'd be nice if somebody were to survive into the future. even if it is just only the wealthy. So yes, we can have no doubt that the bankers and billionaires of today are under no delusion in regards to where and in what true power resides. And so we may infer that the deplorable condition of world politics has been intended, and so can assume that the international banking and business interests must think that they're doing okay, floating above the political destabilization their own investments have proliferated, propping up the governments of the myriads of nationalist and democratically anarchistic regimes, supposing that in a world full of chaos and uncertainty, that the only remaining beacons of hope would be seen in the stability of the international financial and banking sectors and the power of the U.S. dollar. But I expect that the situation will reverse at the advent of the machine intelligence age, when two new imperatives will become the drivers for massive political changes. Yes, for background on this, see my short video series, Revolution from the Top. The first imperative is that all data become consolidated into one network, to be subjected to supercomputer analytics and predictive modeling. And the second imperative is that all resources, both material and productive, be under direct control of the consolidated top of the financial and banking system, making it responsive to the dictates of the machine intelligence system control. What differentiates this organizational template from socialism or communism is that ownership will not be confiscated away, since it is only the control of wealth and resources that the system will require. Already we see supercomputer predictive modeling determining equities and commodity prices in market centers all around the world. First, because it's fast and accurate. But more importantly, perhaps, the banking and financial sectors can afford to invest in these expensive energy-intensive technologies, while the governments save all their big-ticket purchases for their military-industrial complex special interests. And most of their data still remains in dusty filing cabinets, leaving the governments not really knowing what they know. But yes, by the time governments realize the immense power of full data supercomputer predictive and now analytics and modeling, it'll be too late. With the world banking and financial centers easily being able to manipulate and maneuver the governments into financial and economic checkmate situations, where they will be begging for help and willing to accept any conditions, such as what we saw happening in the 2008 financial crisis, when the U.S. government turned the crisis response over to executives from mostly Goldman Sachs, a global leader in investment banking. Also, keep in mind that the banks do not so much own wealth as manage it for their depositors' investors. And so it is this client class who must ultimately approve a switch over to computerized control of their fortunes. Well, embedded in all the predictive modeling will be projections pointing out that with the machine intelligence system, the client class will enjoy hands-off, trouble-free returns on their investments. But if they continue on managing their funds as they do presently, well, Their returns will be dragged down by the colossal scale of human error and inefficiencies that correlate to human being run and operated enterprises, which now goes unspoken of because it's now assumed to be unavoidable. You know, part of what we refer to as the human condition, where to err is human and to forgive divine. But yeah, it's really easy for God to forgive because he doesn't have to put up with any of this screwed up crap. Yes, as much as I have ranted against the amorality of materialism, which understands the phrase, the ends justify the means, as being the first principle of pragmatism and not as a moral rebuke, well, I must now recognize that in regards to the quest for perfection, materialism in producing a machine intelligence system proved to be an honest religion in itself, managing to find in the resources of the world the all-knowingness and the omnipotence the spiritualists long ago stopped expecting from their aloof, incorporeal, transcendental God, and all our religions that only promised a good life after we're dead. So yes, materialism developed super high-capacity computer intelligence and will develop a one-world data network that knows all that is seen, heard, spoken of, or written, and then can deduce the consequences to a stipulated uncertainty. It will be a material perfection that, in order to have faith in, we must only compare it against our own limited animal capacities. Yes, machine intelligence will be the foundational support for humanity's salvation, taking us from this choke jungle that's the best our extremely limited biological capacities is capable of, to a meticulously cultivated garden of glory and delights. From being pinched wild roses of mostly thorns to being the optimization of rose-like beauty, where the ambient fragrances of civilization will be a full-bodied, musky sweetness broad enough in its aesthetic appeal to please everybody. That is, everybody who survives to see the machine intelligence age. Really, it's thank God for survivor's bias. And it's a blessing that the dead really do rest in peace. Also, the banks have a huge problem that ever since the 1980s, with productivity rising to ever new heights because of improvements in technology, with downsizing in employment actually reducing labor's contribution to productivity, well, that led to increasing levels of corporate competitiveness, forcing the banks to cut their interest rates so that the banks themselves wouldn't become the most significant drag on corporate profits. Yes, interest rates peaked at 15.8% in 1981 and have been dropping ever since. Then, to prevent a world pandemic recession in 2020 and 21, most national banks even went to negative, that is, below zero interest rates. Really, for a bank, what's the point any longer? Then, as the technological component of productivity, as wireless untethered robotics become more widely adopted in manufacturing, and information analytics creates an unprecedented wave of downsizing of white-collar employees, well, all this will make the current technological component in productivity seem insignificant by comparison. And so in order to survive in such a new business environment where profit margins would be at near zero, well, the banks would need to radically change their business models, going in the direction of leasing machine intelligence management to those who already own commodity or productive resources. For once interest rates drop to zero, just money becomes too cheap to consider as being of much importance, and value will come to be seen as almost entirely wrapped up in resource ownership. Then, machine intelligence, expensive in itself and very energy hungry, well, not every bank could afford to maintain their own system, which, if they did, would cause a destructively competitive race to the bottom, to be won by any set of banks savvy enough to cartel together, with the independents going out of business. Then, obviously, the most inclusive international banking cartels would have the advantage, with the field eventually being whittled down to one supreme winner. So yes, once big money and the client classes come in on the side of machine intelligence internationalism, we could anticipate that the big money political donors at the national levels would then either cut off their political donations or they'd start paying the politicians to subvert their previous nationalist tendencies and to smooth the way for the conversion to political internationalism. But there would remain the right-wing populist parties as well as the left-wing socialist and anarchist parties. But the predictive modeling would know how to provoke these natural extremists into violence, and so they could then be outlawed and suppressed. Civil conflict around the globe would undoubtedly become extreme. Remember that robotics will replace labor, and so massive unemployment will ensue. Even communist China will be in a bind, and I can't guess how it will work out for them. For although their society is far healthier than in the West, due to their greater social cohesion, well, their economy is still based on exchange of value for labor, that is, wage slavery. And so in order to protect their population from starvation due to unemployment, it would be necessary to keep them in servitude and bondage, still doing all the work and doing it at poor quality. And that in the very nation that leads the world in the production of low-cost, high-quality commercial robotics, which, to me, seems like an insuperable paradox. But with or without China, the primary job for machine intelligence at first would be to produce and deploy robotics weapon systems to secure and protect the world's capital resources and to set up safe havens for the client class. That is, those who can use their ownership of resources as leverage in negotiating for their survival at some stipulated level of affluence. It will be this ownership class, the entitled, who will live to see the first true civilization, where no man is either slave or wage slave to another. And this will be the new freedom, the true freedom, the freedom from work. Well, thanks everybody. That's my video. I hope to come up with something new soon. Thanks again.